So now onto the event graph of our projectile. Where to start with this? Let's start with the movement. So I've copy and pasted everything from the flying pawn in the flying template. So I've got all of the templates in here. I've added them all in, doing add new feature or content pack. And I've taken the flying pawns movement and I've copied and pasted the whole lot. All of this anyways. I left event begin play because I don't have a spring arm to mess around with. But I took everything else from in here, I copied it and I pasted it into this actor, because while this is a pawn, it doesn't need to be a pawn. This could be an actor. It doesn't have a sorry, I'm a bit croaky. It doesn't have a flying pawn movement component or anything. It relies on variables to set itself. So I've copied this lot and I've pasted it into my projectile here. So I've literally copied and pasted everything. As you can see, it's got the same comments and all that stuff. And with these variables that weren't existent in here, I've literally right-clicked and I've promoted them to a variable when they were sort of grayed out and they weren't, and they were causing errors. If I click compile, just right-click, promote to variable, leave it at that. And then I added them all into a flying movement category just to keep them all neatened up. So that's all of those variables. We don't actually need to have all of them because there's other ways of setting up the flying, but I'll come back to that shortly. So I've copied all of the movement logic from the flying pawn into the projectile. And instead of firing it on tick, like it does in the pawn, I'm firing it on a timer, because I'm not always going to want this movement logic to be firing. Not all the time. I'm going to want to turn it off at 2 different times. Well, I'm going to want to turn it off when I'm returning the fist, because I'm not going to be using flying AI to bring the fist back to our character. So it doesn't need to be firing. So it doesn't need to be processing on tick. So on event begin play, I have a set timer by event, which is get well delta seconds. So this is firing at the time in between frames. This event is firing this timer is shooting off this check distance and move event, custom event, pretty damn quickly. So almost on tick. And on this check distance and move, I'm getting the distance from our projectile, ourself, to the character we came from, the instigating character, which we set up the construction script for already. And we have set that in here. I might have forgotten to mention that. It's getting set in here on spawn. We have self plugged into instigator. I did this just so that I didn't have to have another variable inside that's exposed on spawn, so that it keeps my spawn node here kind of small without having lots of variables exposed, because I'm going to be adding more stuff to this that is going to be exposed in the future. But for now, I just wanted to keep this self to instigator, and it probably should be the instigator anyways, because it is the character that is going to be responsible for the damage caused by this projectile. So putting in the third person character, putting a reference of self into the instigator is probably a good practice. So I'm checking our distance between the projectile and the instigating character we came from. And once I've got that distance between them, I'm seeing if we're greater than or equal to a number. I've chosen 10,000 here, so we can go quite far away, but this could be the same number as the line trace hit. This could be the same number as the line trace hit if you were using a range for this, but I'm not. I'm just letting it fly around, but I do want it to come back once it gets too far away. So we're checking that. If this is firing false, so we are not greater than or equal to our limit, we're going to be firing through and doing the same movement logic, the add local, actor local offset, and add local rotation. We're going to be doing the same thing that we would have been doing in the flying movement component. exactly the same, except that I'm using delta seconds here as opposed to delta seconds off of tick, which doesn't really make too much difference either. But yeah, that's the only difference I've got there. And then obviously these two are using all of this flying movement logic down here. All of this flying movement logic can be sort of compressed into functions like I have here. I have the interpolated flying rotation and the instant flying rotation. So all we need from those is the turn speed variable. So like I said a moment ago, we don't necessarily need all of these things because we can calculate all of these things inside a pure function if we wanted to, provided we gave it the right variables to work off. So there's two versions of it that I've got here, the instant flying rotation and the interpolated flying rotation. This one is probably going to be more performance friendly, and we will our fist would literally move with the mouse at the same speed as the mouse moves. Using the interpolated flying rotation, like the flying pawn does, we kind of slowly turn towards the direction we're going to go. So it gives a bit of air resistance, makes things seem a bit more like we're actually flying. Inside the interpolated flying rotation looks something like this, and inside the instant one is much smaller, is something like this. Now I set all of this up, and it took me about 45 minutes to get my head around it all. I'm not going to go through it all right now, but if you're interested in these two functions, I'd be more than happy to make a separate little video that would probably be about 10 minutes long, explaining them and how they work. Because obviously we don't necessarily have to be using get mouse X and Y here. We could be using any axis values we wanted to, and I figured they'd be useful to have as pure functions in a function library so I could use them elsewhere. So yeah, and they could just plug into this delta rotation here. So that's if we're moving. So that's how we get ourselves to move without using a pawn and without using a projectile component, because I didn't want to use a projectile component because it would have been slightly more awkward to control everything, and it's just adding more in than I needed for this fist. In the future I probably will have a projectile component, but it might be deactivated if I'm flying as a fist. It depends on quite a few different things of how. It's mostly about the functionality you want and trying to use as little memory as possible. So not having one at the moment is the best practice. But in the future, if I was using a hierarchy of different projectiles, this might well have a projectile component that just gets deactivated if we're firing the fist as an animated object or anything like that. So once we reach this max distance, we're setting cancel flight here. So cancel flight is another custom event which returns our fist back to the instigating character. So let's go into cancel flight. What cancel flight does is clears and invalidates the timer that we set on event begin play, because once we start returning, we no longer want to be firing all this stuff that was firing on tick. We no longer want to be firing the movement logic. We're going to take that over with something else. And then we have another custom event that gets fired called return actor, which we fire once before setting a timer, which this timer doesn't necessarily have to be on delta seconds, but it works quite well on delta seconds. We're firing this event here, return actor, and we're firing it once before so that we have no delay if we want to have a time greater than delta seconds. So if I put that back to 0.5, because that's actually where I like it. So this is firing every half a second, and we'll have a half-second delay if we don't fire the event once first. So return actor, this is what's going to return us back. I'm getting the instigating character. From that I'm going to need the mesh as well, the mesh of the third person character. I'm getting the distance again, just like before, instigating character being the other actor and our distance is ourselves. And once we're less than or equal to a float that is pretty damn close to our character, that's going to influence whether we are able to attach. So it will look like we're catching our fist. I'll come back to that in a moment. So if we are not close enough to catch the fist, if that's firing false, I'm firing a move component 2 node over and over and over and over again, quite quickly. So it's never going to fire completed. We could branch here and do the same check as before. but I haven't had any problems so far. Because we don't, obviously, of course, we don't want this, all of this attachment logic to fire until this move component 2 has completed. But so yeah, we could put another check here just to make sure of that, but I haven't had any problems so far because I'm firing the event quite fast. It's on either delta seconds or every half a second, so it's pretty close. So we're getting the distance 2. If we're firing false, we're spamming move component 2. The target relative location is the socket that's going to be catching it. So not hand L anymore, but hand R is the hand that's going to be catching the fist when it comes back. So from the instigating characters mesh, get socket location, that's our target relative location, hand R. Then for our target relative rotation is going to be the look at rotation of our actor, the projectile, compared to the location of the instigating character, so that we're always going to be pointing towards the character that we're returning to. So that's the target relative location. Over time, there is a half dozen ways that you could set up over time. I've just gone for taking the turn speed and multiplying get well delta seconds by it. That's what works for me. It's straightforward and simple. We could just set it to a set value. You can do quite a lot of manipulation. This is going to directly affect how quickly our fist comes back to us. And the component we're moving is the root component of this actor, so we'll move the whole actor. A word about move component 2. It seems to stop blocking collision, so our fist will fly through anything in its path. I think it still triggers overlaps, though I haven't tested that. I read that in documentation, that it would... Move component 2 would still trigger overlaps, but it doesn't. We will no longer block everything in our path. So this isn't the best way of doing it. This is just the quick and dirty way of doing it. It's also a way that guarantees our fist is going to come back. Because even if we use flying AI, there is a chance that our fist might get stuck behind something, or stuck in a loop, or we might move to a point that it can't reach. So we wouldn't be able to return, which is definitely a problem. We definitely want to be catching our fist again, particularly if we're only spawning one of them. If we're only shooting one fist at a time, we definitely want to be able to get our fist back. So it's pros and its cons. It's not as realistic as using flying AI. Using flying AI, our projectile would use pathfinding, use flying pathfinding, 3D pathfinding to fly itself around the place and dodge things and weave around other objects to get back to our character. With move component 2, it will just move straight through them. But if we set the overtime to quite fast, that's not all that noticeable, and it's probably a slightly safer way of doing it, unless you don't mind having a fist going missing now and again. So, we're firing this move component 2 over and over again, and it's never going to complete. Because we don't want it to complete until we're ready to be attached. We're ready for it to be reattached when we get within... I've put 75 here. I could make it smaller or slightly more, but I found 75 was a pretty good number for it. So when that fires true, when we are less than or equal to 75, away from the instigating character, we're ready to be caught. Or rather, it's not from... Bearing in mind we're still going to be traveling to the location of the hand, so we'll already be almost at the hand by the time this fires. So when that fires true, I'm clearing and invalidating the timer again. So that's the timer that's firing this return actor. So we clear that so it doesn't fire anymore because we don't need to keep firing it. Then I'm setting actor enable collision to nothing. I'm not going to avoid disabling collision here because I'm about to destroy this actor over the next event. So this actor is about to get destroyed, so I'm just disabling its collision so we don't accidentally hit ourselves with it when it gets really close. And then we fire the move component 2 node one last time. This time the move component 2 node is going to complete. But because we're firing that move component 2 node and letting it complete so close to the actor, it's not going to be too noticeable. Even if we're moving, it still looks a lot like we're catching the fist. But we'll still be moving. If we're still moving, we'll end up running away from the fist most of the time. but once we get within this sort of range, even if we're moving, it's still gonna look pretty much like we're catching the fist. I'll show this all in a moment. So we'll fire the move component 2 node one last time, and on completed, we're going to set the actor relative transform. Now this looks like a pretty strange transform, and unlike the spawning of the fist, where I'm setting the actor's rotation to point where it's supposed to be pointing, and I'm setting its location to exactly where it's supposed to be if it was part of the character, because bearing in mind we're shooting the hand L, and when I'm spawning it, I'm setting its spawn location to the location of hand L, and I've set the origin of the mesh to hand L as to the origin of the hand L bone, the head of the hand L bone. It's already getting spawned that way in exactly the right place. There's no real way of doing that back when we're catching it with the wrong hand. I can't just snap it to hand R, otherwise it's going to take up the same position that hand R is in, or rather hand R rotated upside down probably, because it would have a different, it would need the hand R but the wrong way round, as if it was a glove that was on the wrong way round, so the thumb would be on the wrong side. So I needed to get the relative transform that I'd be attaching it to. To get that relative transform, I've added a mock mesh to the third person character here. So this is just a static mesh of hand L that's been re-imported, and it's currently not visible and hidden in the game, and I could delete this now because I've got its transform. But if I set that to visible, I'll show you exactly what I did to get it. So right now it doesn't look quite right, we've just got this hand sort of floating there, but that's because we're not in the catching animation. So I set this up, I added this static mesh component and parented it to the mesh. I attached it to the hand R socket, because that's where we're going to be attaching it to in a moment in the blueprint. And I've adjusted its location and rotation to be just right for the catching animation. To adjust it for the catching animation, I've taken my mesh here, the character mesh, and I've taken use animation blueprint, set that to use animation asset, pulled up the shoot fist attach asset and turned off looping so that I could see where it's going to be when I attach it. And as you can see, if I select the fist again, it is almost in exactly the same space that the animated fist is in, because we haven't yet set back our mesh. This is currently in the blueprint, our character mesh still is missing its hand, so we're attaching this back on where there isn't a hand. And I've just used this mock mesh to try and get it as close as I can to where it's supposed to be while it's attached to hand R, and then I can get its relative location and rotation necessary to make it look like it's attaching back onto the wrist of the left hand that it came from. I hope you're following this. It's not too complicated. You should be able to see what I'm doing. So yeah, it looks like he's plugging his fist back on. So that's how I got the relative transform. Let me just turn that back. Make this swap. Let's undo what I just did there. The mesh wants to be using its blueprint, and this wants to be not visible anymore, so I don't get too confused about it. But yeah, that's how I got the relative location and rotation. That's how I got the relative location and rotation, to be able to attach it back. So I'm setting that relative transform that I got from the third person character's viewport, and then I'm getting the instigating character, getting its mesh, and attaching it to component at, you guessed it, the hand R socket, making sure to keep relative location and keep relative rotation. I set the scale to relative as well because I'm not messing with the scale at the moment, so that's not really a big deal. Yeah, and welding simulated bodies as well, although I've disabled collision, so that's not really too much of a big deal. It would be if we were doing a skeletal mesh though, that might be simulating physics, but I'm not doing a hand with simulating fingers to fly around with at the moment. So yeah, we're attaching it to the component, keeping relative, and we found the relative from the viewport of the third person character by just temporarily changing around the mesh. And I can now delete the Just Hand L mesh component. I'm going to leave it there so I can refer to it in case I decide to change anything, but this isn't necessary now and I could delete it because I've got its location and rotation. Yes. So once we've attached it to the component, I'm going to fire shoot fist attached. So yeah, the reason I've set the timer for 0.5 is just so that I can let that fist get really close and then I can run away from it. And because it's only doing it every half a second, we get a slight delay in it starting to follow us again. And the move component 2 node is going to keep getting fired every half a second. And that fist is always going to be trying to rotate towards us as well. I just kind of like the effect it has. If we have it on world delta seconds, it's a really smooth thing. There's no little lag there, and I quite like the little bit of lag as we start running away. The fist is like, oh, where's it gone? And then starts following us. That completely goes away. If you want it to just directly follow you, stick that timer on world delta seconds, and it will just keep following you. There'll be very little to no lag. I'll just show that. So if we plug world delta seconds into this timer here, for the return actor timer, then there'll be none of that little lag as it's chasing us. It will just keep coming towards us no matter where we run. We can let it get really close, and if we keep running away from it, it's going to keep it just keeps smoothly coming towards us all the time. Whereas having the timer on every half second gives that little bit of lag. You could even increase it to a second if you wanted to, but I prefer it on half a second. So let's check if we're getting hits. It'll make him simulate if I can make it fly through him. Oh yeah, no, it's not getting hits. It's blocking collision, as you can see. It's going through Mr. Mannequin there. It's just going clean through him. And it'll go through these things as well. It won't call up any blocking hits. And just come through and appear. But that's the safe way of doing it. Then we can also reduce this timer here. I could set this overtime timer to, say, 0.1. And it will just whiz straight back to us, I think. And we'll get barely any time to run away from it. So if you don't want to be able to run away from the fist, it's just going to whiz straight back, see? Whizzes straight back to us at high speed. So the overtime speed and the speed of the timer itself is quite useful to... They're kind of the variables you can use to mess around with that move component 2 node. Is this timer adds a little bit of lag on when it processes, and this overtime is literally how fast it comes back to us. So yeah. So once we've attached a component, we're going to get the shoot fist attached event from the instigating character and fire that off. I'm going to come back to the projectile for a little bit more in a moment. So this shoot fist attached, here it is, in the third person character, yet another custom event. The first thing it's going to do is set a boolean that I have called isAttaching to true. So isAttaching needs to be set to true just for the duration of this play montage to attach it. So now instead of firing the attach section, the fire section, I'm now using the attach section of the shoot fist montage. Obviously on the same skeletal mesh again, and we play that montage. On blend out, I'm going to destroy the actor, destroy the last projectile fired, set last projectile fired to nothing, so that it's nothing, and I can use it and check it to see if it is anything with equals and not equals. So we're setting it back to nothing, and then we're setting the skeletal mesh back to the skeletal mesh that has both hands. So we're no longer missing a hand. Then once that's happened, I'm turning isAttaching off so that we were going to end up blending back out, because that's how the onTick function down here works. So as soon as we start aiming, we start using the upper body animation blend. And if we're attaching, we also use the upper body animation blend. So yeah, isAttaching is false, so we can turn off the upper body animation blend unless we are still aiming. If we're still aiming, aiming will still be true, but we won't be playing the correct montage anymore. So we'll fire through, shoot fist aim is then going to be fired again, just like before on the spawn here. If we're aiming, we want to continue aiming, so we fire shoot fist aim to get ourselves back into that frozen first frame using the play montage in the shoot fist aim event. So we're setting the montage back. You'd still want to do this even if you were using a proper aiming animation, because that aiming animation would be looping. So we'd want to fire that back to make it play the correct section again. So whatever happens, if we're aiming, we want to continue aiming. So we'll fire shoot fist aim again. And then when we fire shoot fist aim, also when we fire shoot fist aim, last projectile fired will equal to nothing. So we're going to end up at the end of it, we're going to end up setting can fire to true, because this will equal nothing, because we just destroyed the actor and set the variable back to nothing. Is that a hole I saw? I think I might have just seen a hole in my logic. Where's my attachment? Is attaching get set to false on blend out? We don't want is attaching set to false on blend out. Only want it if it's interrupted and on completed, because otherwise we won't play the rest of the animation. So on completed we would set is attaching. Like I said, I'm always changing up these blueprints and finding different ways of making them work. Just shuffle this around a bit. Yeah, this works. This should work. That should look a bit better. So when we've completed it, or if we've interrupted it, we're setting is attaching to false. When we start blending out, we want to get rid of the actor. So if we get interrupted before blend out happens, we're going to fire through all the same logic, because the last projectile fired is still a thing. The variable hasn't been set and the actor hasn't been destroyed. So if we get interrupted after we start blending out, then the destroy actor will have fired. Last projectile fired will have been set to nothing. So this branch will come up false and we won't fire through the same logic again. But we'll set is attaching to false. Yes, that's the way this should be. This should be like this. That should look a bit better now. We kind of snapped back into the animation. The animation for reattaching looks a lot better when I'm destroying the actor and setting the mesh back on blend out, because on blend out is going to fire just before the fist gets put back on the hand. If we get interrupted, however, if this montage gets interrupted, we need to just quickly set everything back so that it looks right. Right, so the finer points of set projectile view. So in the player controller, the projectile controllable, the controllable projectile, I have brought in the left shift input. It's consuming input. This is what it's set to by default anyways. And instigating character, we're just on released. So we only need the on released side of this, because I'm not going to be pressing this at the moment while we're in here. So when it gets pressed, I don't need to set is shift held true and then set the projectile view back to it, because we're already using this as projectile view. I only want to turn off the projectile view for this and send it back to the character. So if shift is held when we fire the fist, when we let go of it, it's going to fire this here. It's going to fire this released, because we're going to once it's been fired, we'll have taken control. This is what will be receiving our input, and when we release it, it will pull up the release, but it won't ever pull up the pressed, because chances are we've already pressed this before we come in here, before we come into the projectile controllable. Before we start controlling it, we will have pressed shift. So we only need the release function to turn set projectile view false in order to send the view target, back to the third person character and disable the input for the projectile. So that is most of this logic. Set projectile view. Now I just need to go over now I just need to go over the onHit function. But before I do, these input axes here, I've brought them in because we don't necessarily need to have the move up axis from the third person template, from the flying template that I brought in, that I showed not that long ago. We don't necessarily need input axis move up because I'm going to be using the same thing as the lookup axis. So I brought this in here, and this might well be consuming the input axis and stopping our character from moving around. Same with the turning. We're consuming the input so it's not getting sent anywhere else. And I just brought those in as a temporary thing. So in our projectile, it's probably going to be a good idea to block input so that we don't have our character moving around anywhere, though he doesn't seem to be moving around anywhere at the moment. So block input might be something you need to use. I'm not going to use it for now because I haven't found a need to, and I don't want to shoot myself in the foot by telling you to block input and then it becomes a problem later on. It's just something I'm going to keep an eye on while I'm messing around with this and expanding on it, is I might end up blocking input here. So onHit, I have the same deflect when colliding logic that was in the flying pawn, which is just getting the actor rotation, lerping that to the rotation from X vector of the hit normal when we hit something, and I changed the alpha from the very low, I think it was 0.025 or 0.225 or something like that was the deflection. Now I've got it at 0.5, so we seem to bounce off quite a lot, which is how I wanted it, using the shortest path, and we set the actor rotation on hit, just to make it look like we're bouncing. Now this bit here, so I wanted my fist, let's say what my goal was, and then I'll explain how I achieved it. My goal was to have my fist bounce around the map unless I hit something specific. So if I hit my other third person character that I have sat in the level waiting to be shot at, if I hit him, I want the fist to come straight back. However, if I miss him and it's going to bounce off static objects like the stairs and the walls. So to do that, I've got two integers. I've got hits, which is how many times we have hit something. I've got max hits, which is what we'd set either on spawn or per projectile, how many times it can bounce. All I'm going to do is take hits and increment it, and then check to see the max hits. Check to see if we're equal to or greater than the maximum amount of hits we can get. If we are greater than or equal to the max hits, once this has been incremented, that's going into an OR boolean. I'll come back to the other pin in a moment. And if this OR boolean fires true, we cancel flight just like we did here, which then clears the timer on the movement and returns the actor, just like before. So the other pin on this boolean, I'm taking the actor object reference here and I'm casting it. This could be an array of various different actors, but for now, just to demonstrate this, I'm just taking this other actor that we've hit and casting it to the third person character on a convert to pure cast. So if that's a successful cast, then we no longer care if we've reached the max hits or not. We've hit the thing that's going to make us return, and we're going to fire true as well. I'm also checking just before I set these hits that we're not hitting ourselves. If we want to hit ourselves, we just remove this branch. But I don't want to be hitting myself with the fist. I don't mind if the fist bounces off, but I didn't want hitting ourselves to count towards our max hits. So I'm just quickly checking that this other actor is not equal to the instigating character, and if it is a third person character though, then we'll cancel flight. But like I said, I'm only casting this here just to make a small example. Really, this should probably be an array of actors that would cause the fist to return, or various other situations. There's quite a few different things you could put into this OR boolean, but this is how I'm keeping it for now. Just for now. I'm sure I'll find lots of things that should make the fist return, but I can only think of a few things right now. Mainly if we hit something and cause damage, we'd probably want to return the fist, as opposed to letting it continue to bounce around. Or you could take that pin out altogether and not check what we've hit, and it can hit more than one thing and do damage to more than one thing at once. Maybe that could be a talent. In a talent tree is that when you shoot your fist, instead of returning when it causes damage, it can continue to bounce around and do more damage to things. Or maybe you could set it to target and home things as well. I'll come to homing projectiles in the future probably. It's not too difficult to do. I'm setting up a proper targeting system at the moment as it is anyways, like locked on targeting. So that's the on hit function. Cancelling flight, because I'm not actually causing any damage. We could fire true, cancel flight and do damage to whatever character, but I'd probably have that set up on a different hit event inside the third person character as opposed to firing off the logic for causing damage here, just to keep this blueprint as simple as it can be. So that's the on hit, that's the movement I've gone over, that's the left shift setting the projectile view back. It is now finally time for me to show it all in action properly. Let's not shoot the fist quite so far away this time. So if we're not moving, we're not going to be adding any velocity vector math onto the direction of the fist. So it's going to spawn at the socket location. And we'll pop it out. It will bounce 5 times and then return to us. Here it comes. Let's see if that attaching animation looks a bit better now that I swap that background. We snatch and grab and pop it back on. Yeah, that's a bit better. And then obviously we can keep pressing Q. We're not going to shoot and fire loads of fists. Although I'll show you what happens if you set it up wrong and that ends up happening. If I press shift, I start taking control of the fist and I can fly around with it. Let's go back to the character quickly. I can watch this all the way up to the point that it gets grabbed as well. So, grabbed and reattached and then destroyed, and we come back to our third person character. So we have aiming, we start aiming. Let's just shoot this up to the sky. And we can go backwards and forwards from our character, controlling our fist. You can see my keyboard at the bottom. I'm going to keep holding down the movement keys, and when I let go of shift, we'll go back to our character and he won't be moving anywhere until we get back to him, yeah? So he stops moving when we swap to it. So his movement is obviously getting overwritten. Yeah, we can fly around at high speed as a fist, just like the flying pawn. That's how I have it set up at the moment. We can bounce 5 times. And then we're going to return. Let's have a look at that animation. It looked a bit choppy before. Yeah, it looks like it's trying to jump straight back in. Like it's not blending properly. Maybe I'll try and troubleshoot that in a moment. Shoot it here. Let's have a good look at that when it comes back. See, we deflected off ourselves, but we didn't get a hit, so it's going to bounce another couple times. Yeah, we're jumping straight back into it. There's something not quite right there. I think maybe I haven't got the montage bit just in the right place here. It looks like it's catching the end. Looks like it's just catching the end of shoot fist fire when it shouldn't. Let's try that. If not that, it's going to be something to do with when I'm setting the variables on and off. Let it shoot around a bit. Come back to us. There we go, that's better. I didn't have the montage section set quite perfectly. So there's something for you. Keep an eye on that. The montage sections need to be set up quite precisely. Otherwise you're going to get the ends of or the beginnings of the wrong sections playing and things aren't going to look quite right. So need to have good eyes for setting those up. unless there's a way to snap them that I don't know of. There may be a way to snap things to the beginning frames of the montage sections. You could probably do it with math. You could probably figure out the exact frame of the whole montage and then set the starting point of that section to that. So yeah, that's shooting fist logic. Oh yeah, if I shoot my fist at the third person character here that I've put in, this one that isn't being controlled, instead of bouncing around it, we're going to hit him and then come straight back. And there you see my simulation component that is going to be something else I'm going to work through. So next I'm going to go on to the targeting for this, because I don't want to be able to shoot the fist behind me, because it's not going to work. We're going to end up colliding with ourselves and bouncing off, and we wouldn't be able to shoot the fist backwards like that anyways. So that's just something that needs to be sorted out.